Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about keys to kanji pronunciation. Now, the biggest single key to kanji pronunciation is a hack that I taught a while back, which is the sound sisters. For a relatively small investment of time, this is going to give you the pronunciations of hundreds of kanji and thousands of words. So I'm going to put a link to that above my head and in the information section below. If you haven't encountered the sound sisters yet, you really should do so. However, there are some other things happening with the pronunciation of kanji which are very helpful to know in addition to the sound sisters. Now, if you know my work, I'm sure you know that I won't ask you to, and I don't want you to start trying to learn readings of kanji in the abstract. We learn how kanji are pronounced from learning words. But understanding the sounds that can be used and the ways in which they can occasionally change helps us to remember and understand how words are pronounced. A question that I often get asked, particularly by people who have done all or some of the Heisig method, so they actually know a lot of kanji, but they have no idea at all how they're pronounced, is when I see a 2 or 3 or more kanji word, and I get the furigana, so I know what the pronunciation is, how do I know which kana belong to which kanji? Now, if you're learning kanji organically, the way I recommend learning kanji organically, and I'll put a link above my head and in the information section below, you won't have this problem nearly so much as someone who's front-loaded with Heisig and English keywords. However, it's still worth understanding the principles here. The first thing to understand is that when we're talking about the on readings, that's the Chinese readings of kanji, these are the readings you're going to see most of the time in words of more than one kanji which have no okurigana. That's to say they don't have any following kana that are part of the word. And some textbooks, the more informative ones, will tell you that, generally speaking, in words with no okurigana, you get on readings, not kun readings. That's to say Chinese, not Japanese readings. And it's a bit of a hit or miss way of describing it. And the reason they put it that way is because of the very strange model of the Japanese language that they have, which is full of things like na adjectives and adverbs. As you know, if you've watched my videos, nearly all Japanese words fall into one of 3 types. They are either verbs or adjectives, or if they're not verbs or adjectives, they're nearly always nouns. Of course, this gets obscured if you start calling adjectival nouns na adjectives or adverbial nouns adverbs. Anything with 2 kanji and no kana is a noun. All verbs and all adjectives always have kana as well as kanji, because at the very least they must have an I on the end, not part of the kanji, or an ro kana on the end, not part of the kanji. So if we are dealing with an all kanji word, with very, very few exceptions, that word is a noun. And these multiple kanji nouns are almost all originally Chinese, and that means that each of the kanji will have its on reading. Now, this is a huge section of Japanese vocabulary, and the thing we need to understand if we're ever asking questions like which kanji belong to which kana is that just about all on readings consist of either 1 or 2 mora. Now, a mora is a unit of pronunciation in Japanese. Most of the time, it's equivalent to a single kana. So, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko, na, ni, nu, ne, no. Each of those is 1 mora. And An on-reading is going to be one mora or two. So a two kanji Chinese-based noun, which is most two kanji nouns, can have a maximum of 4 mora. Now, sometimes we're going to see them with up to 6 characters. Why is that? The reason for that is that the small versions of ya, yu, and yo, which join to the kana before them, fuse together with it to form a single mora. So it sounds like ryu, nya, etc. These are single mora. So when you see a kana with a small ya, yu, or yo after it, that is a single kana sound. So once we understand that, we can understand that the on-reading of any kanji is going to be either 1 or 2 single kana sounds. Now, we become able to make sense of all this and have a good chance to predict what's going to happen in any given on-reading once we understand the real reason behind this law that an on-reading can only have 1 or 2 kana sounds. The reason is that in Chinese, one hanzi, which is what became kanji in Japanese, can only represent a single syllable. So why can it represent either 1 or 2 kana sounds? Well, fortunately for us, for our limited practical purposes here, we can say that Chinese is the same as English in the way that it defines syllables. So, for example, in English, we can have the words shack, or hag, or mitts, or hats, and all of those are a single syllable. But in Japanese, because you can't have a consonant without an attached vowel after it, they all have to be 2 mora. Shaku, haku, hatsu, mitsu, and these are all actual on-readings in Japanese. 1 syllable in Chinese, 2 mora in Japanese. And there are 2 other ways in which this happens. For example, the on-reading of umi, sea, is kai. So the word for a pirate is kaizoku, sea robber. Now this again is 2 kana sounds in Japanese, isn't it? Ka and I. So why is that? Well, just as in English, if we take the word I, a 1-letter word, and the most important word in the English language, particularly American English, this is what's called a diphthong, which is what happens when 2 vowel sounds are smashed together to make 1 syllable. Now what do I mean by 2 vowel sounds? Well, if you try to take a long time singing the word I, you'll find that at some point you have to change from the first vowel sound to the second. I. Try it yourself. You can't do it without changing, unless you come from Texas or Alabama. So while in English and Chinese sounds like I, together with any attached consonant like kai or tai, count as 1 syllable, in Japanese it's 2 kana sounds. And once again, in a word like joho, information or report, each of the kanji is 2 kana sounds. Jo, ho. Why is that? Well, again, Chinese and English are the same here. If we say a word like showboat, both of those are long vowels. It's not showbot, it's showboat. In English, that doesn't make any difference, and it's the same in Chinese. Even a long vowel is still 1 syllable. But in Japanese, vowels are all of equal length, and if you want to double them, it becomes another mora. So those are the 3 circumstances under which an on-reading can be 2 kana sounds instead of 1. Now this doesn't of course apply to kun readings, because, for example, the kun reading of kai is umi, sea, and that really is 2 syllables in any language, u and mi, because it's broken by a consonant in the middle. It can't be less than 2 syllables in any language. But that's okay because it's a kun reading. It's a native Japanese word that's simply been superimposed over a kanji. It's not a two-kanji noun in which each kanji has its originally Chinese on reading. And in those relatively few words, which are verbs and adjectives with two kanji, these will always be kun readings. And it doesn't make any sense to ask what the reading of each kanji is. So, for example, oishii, which has two kanji, it's no point asking which kanji is the o and which kanji is the i. Doesn't work like that. A native Japanese word has been superimposed over two Chinese characters that mean beautiful taste. And that's what a kun reading is. If you take off the shi and turn it into a noun, then the pronunciation is bime, which is the on-reading of the first and second kanji. Now let's put this into practice. Let's take a word like chomiryo, which means seasoning or flavoring. The first kanji sound is cho, the second is u. The third is mi. Now we know that u and mi can't belong together as on readings because umi would make two syllables in English or Chinese or any language. Umi is, of course, the kun reading, meaning see, but nothing split up with a consonant in the middle can be an on reading. Words like ishi, oto, kata, hana, etc., all of which are kun readings of single kanji, can't be on readings. Therefore, we know how to break up this word. Cho has to belong together, mi has to be on its own, miryo also won't make an on reading because it's broken by a consonantal sound, ryo. So the only way to break it up is cho, mi, ryo, and applying these principles, you're nearly always going to know which on readings belong to which kanji. Now, once we understand this, we can start to talk about the sound changes that sometimes take place within these on readings. There are two main ones, and neither of them happen all the time. Both of them happen most of the time, and they are completely regular. So if they happen, we know exactly what they're going to be like. And also, the next thing we know is that they only happen in certain circumstances. And if we have learned about counters, which I taught in a recent lesson, I'll put a link above my head, we already know pretty much what the circumstances are and how they're going to work. These sound changes only affect words in which the first kana of the second kanji can take a ten-ten. So that means kana from the ka, sa, ta, and ha columns. Those are the only kanji that can take ten-ten. Now they're not going to take a ten-ten, but the simplest and most straightforward way of identifying the ones that can change is the ones that can take a ten-ten. If it can't take a ten-ten, the change isn't going to happen. So the first change is what Alice calls in my book Alice in Kanji Land small tsu hooking. And what this means is that when we have two kanji, and the first one ends in either tsu or chi, and the second one can take a ten-ten, but doesn't have one, the tsu or the chi turns into a small tsu. And that's all, except for the ha column. So, for example, with moonlight, whose on readings are getsu, moon, and ko, light, but we didn't say getsu ko, we say gekko, because getsu ends in a tsu, and ko is a kana that can take a ten-ten. It can become go. We're not giving it the ten-ten, but we are making this transformation. So, getsu plus ko becomes gekko. The same with sunlight. Nichi, which is sun, plus ko doesn't become nichiko, but nikko. So this is exactly the same as what happens in counters with ichi, for example. You don't say ichisatsu, one volume, you say issatsu. You don't say ichikai, one story in a house, we say ikkai. So it's exactly the same transformation that's happening here, where the first kanji has two kana, and the second kana is either tsu or chi. It doesn't happen all the time, it does happen most of the time, and the transformation is the same every time. Either it happens that way or it doesn't happen. And if the first kana of the second kanji can't take a ten-ten, then it isn't going to happen. If the first kana of the second kanji is from the ha, hi, hu, he, ho column, just as with ichi, it takes a maru to become pa, pi, pu, pe, po. So, just as ichi-hiki becomes ippiki, so shutsu plus hatsu, which is the departure of a vehicle or something, becomes not shutsu hatsu, but shuppatsu. Shuppai, a mistake, made up of shitsu and hai. It's not shitsu hai, it's shuppai. Announcement, hatsu plus hyo is not hatsu hyo, but happyo, announcement. Now the other main set of changes that takes place between on-readings is when the second kana of the first kanji is and the second one begins with a kana from the ha, hi, hu, he, ho column, just that one, the ha, hi, hu, he, ho column. Then normally it takes a maru to become pa, pi, pu, pe, po. And we're all familiar with this happening, for example, in senpai, which is sem plus hai, which becomes not se hai, but senpai. Shimpi, mysterious, which consists of shin and hi, the hi of himitsu, becomes not shin-hi, but shimpi. Kanpeki, perfect, which is made up of kan plus heki, becomes not kan-heki, but kanpeki. And actually these words like kan-heki and sen-hai are quite difficult to say if you try saying them. So I think that's probably the main reason for this change. One more change that's worth noticing, and this doesn't affect just on readings, in fact it affects kun readings more often than it affects on readings, although it can affect both, is that where we have two nouns, both of which can stand alone, that are joined together to make a compound noun, if the first kanji of the second noun can take a ten-ten, in this case, it does. We're still dealing with those same four columns. They're the ones that change all the time. Ka, sa, ta, and ha. But this time they actually take that ten-ten. So, for example, bookshelf, hondana. Hon, book, and tana, shelf, both can stand alone as nouns, but when they're put together into a compound noun, they become not hontana, but hondana. When we put together arm and clock, arm is ude, clock is toke, we get not ude toke, but ude doke, which is a wristwatch, literally an arm clock. When we get gomi, which is trash, and hako, which is box, we put them together, we make not gomi hako, but gomi bako, which in Japanese is how we say a trash can. And when we use the same word twice to imply multiplicity, we say things like, for example, hito bito, not hito hito. So that second hito gets a ten-ten. Or again, gods. A god is kami, and when we talk about gods in the plural, we sometimes say kamigami, not kami-kami, because that second Kami takes the 10-10. And obviously this only happens where a 10-10 can be applied. And an important side note here is that 10-10 hooking will never happen when there's a 10-10 anywhere else in the second word. Even if the second word is more than one kanji long, if there's a 10-10 anywhere in that word, 10-10 hooking isn't going to happen. The other time it doesn't happen is where it causes ambiguity with another reasonably common word. Now, if we understand these basic principles, we get a much clearer idea of how a given word is likely to be pronounced. And as we see, there are certain sound changes that take place regularly in Japanese, and they almost always affect the same group of kana, the ones that can take a 10-10. So, once we realize that, and we realize what those regular sound shifts are, we are not faced with lots and lots of random exceptions. We understand that there are certain simple processes that happen under certain very clearly defined conditions. The only problem is that they don't happen all the time, but all of these take place when the conditions are met, more often than not, most of the time. And when they don't, they simply revert to not being changed. They're not different in different circumstances. They're regular. They either take place or they don't. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels, who make these videos possible, and all my patrons, who are all angels, from the pink Kokeshi right up to the gold ones. I love all of you. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.